Ryan Drake was a man of focus, determination, and quiet ambition. After years of struggling to make ends meet, he had finally found his calling as the owner of a small yet thriving shop specializing in rare and antique musical instruments. Nestled on the edge of a suburban neighborhood, his business had become a sanctuary for collectors and musicians alike, a place where passion and craft met under one roof. The shop itself was a reflection of Ryan's meticulous nature-polished wooden floors, carefully arranged displays, and a sense of timeless charm that made customers feel like they were stepping into another era. The parking lot outside, though plain in appearance, was a crucial part of the shop's operation. With just enough space to accommodate Ryan's steady flow of clients, the lot was vital for maintaining the business's reputation as a convenient and welcoming destination. Ryan had even gone to the trouble of installing custom signage, clearly marking the lot as private parking for customers only, with warnings about towing for unauthorized vehicles. He knew better than to leave things to chance. Unfortunately, not everyone shared his respect for boundaries. The trouble started gradually. Ryan noticed a few unfamiliar cars parked in the lot during his quieter hours. At first he thought little of it, assuming they belonged to customers from the nearby bakery or hair salon. But soon, the problem escalated. Entire rows of spaces were being occupied by vehicles that had nothing to do with his shop. By mid-afternoon on some days, there was barely enough room left for his own clients to park. Through casual observation, Ryan quickly identified the culprits: the family living in the house directly across the street, led by his neighbor Vivian Clark. Vivian was a middle-aged woman with an air of entitlement and a personality as abrasive as nails on a chalkboard. Her 3 grown sons, their friends, and their numerous vehicles had turned the parking lot into their personal overflow garage. Trucks, sedans, and even an old RV regularly spilled out from their driveway and into Ryan's lot, completely ignoring his signs. Ryan wasn't the type to start a fight. He valued professionalism and believed in resolving issues with a calm, measured approach. So the first time he caught Vivian outside while watering her lawn, he addressed the issue politely. "Hi, Vivian," he began, forcing a smile. "I've noticed some cars from your house parking in my lot lately. It's causing problems for my customers. Would you mind asking your family to use your driveway instead?" Vivian looked up from her watering can, her expression blank for a moment before shifting into a disingenuous smile. "Oh, I hadn't realized. You know how it is kids these days. They just park wherever it's closest. I'll talk to them." Ryan thanked her and hoped the issue was resolved, but the cars kept coming. A few days later, he approached one of her sons directly as the young man was getting into his truck. "Hey, I've got clients coming in all afternoon. I need this space cleared for them." The son barely acknowledged Ryan, muttering a dismissive "yeah, sure" before driving off. The next day, 2 more vehicles appeared. By the 3rd week, Ryan's patience was wearing thin. He left notes on the windshields of the offending cars, reiterating that the lot was private property. He even spoke to a few of his regular clients, apologizing for the inconvenience and explaining the situation. Many sympathized, but Ryan could sense their frustration. One collector who had traveled several hours to visit the shop expressed annoyance at having to park several blocks away. The final straw came on a Saturday morning, one of the busiest days of the week. Ryan had scheduled an exclusive viewing for a high-profile client, a well-known pianist, who was interested in purchasing a rare 19th-century grand piano. He had gone to great lengths to prepare for the appointment, ensuring that the piano was polished, tuned, and ready for demonstration. But as Ryan arrived at the shop that morning, his stomach sank. The parking lot was completely full, not a single space left for his client. The vehicles were unmistakably those of Vivian's family, including the massive RV that seemed permanently stationed across 2 spaces. Ryan's hands tightened into fists as he stood there, staring at the lot. He had tried being polite. He had tried being patient. But this was beyond inconsiderate, it was outright disrespect. Without hesitating, he pulled out his phone and called a local towing company. Within the hour, tow trucks arrived and began removing the offending vehicles one by one. Ryan made sure to stand by, watching as the RV was hauled off last. A small crowd of onlookers gathered, some amused, others curious, but Ryan didn't care. He needed his lot cleared, and he wasn't going to let anyone disrupt his business. By the time the client arrived, the lot was pristine, and the viewing went off without a hitch. The pianist was thrilled with the instrument and promised to return with a formal offer. For the first time in weeks, Ryan felt a sense of relief. He had done what he needed to do to protect his livelihood, and he assumed that would be the end of it. He was wrong. The very next morning, Vivian showed up at the shop in a fury. She didn't knock or wait to be invited in. She stormed through the door, her face flushed with anger, and began shouting before Ryan could get a word in. "What the hell do you think you're doing, towing our cars like that?" Ryan tried to maintain his composure, though her aggressive tone immediately set him on edge. "Vivian, I've spoken to you about this multiple times. Your family's been taking up my parking spaces and hurting my business. I had no choice." "No choice," she snapped. "You embarrassed my family in front of the entire neighborhood. My son had to pay hundreds of dollars to get his car back, and he injured his leg trying to stop the tow truck." Ryan blinked, thrown by the accusation. I wasn't aware of any injuries. The towing company was just doing their job." "You're going to pay for this," Vivian interrupted, her voice low and venomous. "I'll see you in court." Before Ryan could respond, she spun on her heel and marched out, slamming the door behind her. For a moment he just stood there, stunned. The idea of being sued over a parking dispute seemed absurd, but the fire in Vivian's eyes told him she wasn't bluffing. Ryan couldn't have known it then, but her threat was only the beginning of a much larger battle, one that would test not only his patience and resilience but his ability to stand up for what was right in the face of relentless adversity. Ryan tried to shake off the unease that Vivian's visit had left behind, but it clung to him like a shadow. The shop was quiet that afternoon, the faint hum of an antique music box playing in the background as he went through his inventory. Yet he couldn't focus. Her words replayed in his mind on a loop. "You're going to pay for this. I'll see you in court." It was the venom in her tone, the conviction behind her glare, that unsettled him most. By the time he locked up the shop for the night, Ryan had almost convinced himself it was an empty threat. Vivian was angry, sure, but suing someone over a towing incident seemed far-fetched. She had no real grounds, right? His lot was private property, clearly marked, and the cars had been parked there without his permission. Still, the nagging feeling of doubt refused to subside. The next morning, Ryan arrived at the shop to find a large white envelope waiting for him, wedged into the gap between the door and its frame. His name and the shop's address were handwritten across the front, the script oddly deliberate, almost taunting. With a sigh, he opened it and pulled out a stack of papers. At first, he couldn't make sense of what he was looking at: a dense wall of legal jargon, bold headers, and a formal tone that sent a chill down his spine. It was a summons. Vivian had filed a lawsuit against him. According to the complaint, Ryan was being accused of a litany of offenses: illegal towing, trespassing, harassment, and even causing bodily harm. Vivian claimed that her son had injured his leg while attempting to prevent the towing of their vehicles, and that the entire ordeal had caused her family significant emotional distress. She was seeking damages for medical bills, vehicle repairs, and of course pain and suffering. Ryan's stomach sank as he flipped through the pages. The language was carefully crafted to paint him as the villain, a ruthless business owner who had deliberately targeted an innocent family. It was absurd. He had warned Vivian multiple times, left notes on the cars, and followed the legal process to have them towed. None of it mattered. She was twisting the narrative to suit her agenda, and now he was being dragged into a legal battle he hadn't asked for. Setting the papers down, Ryan took a deep breath and tried to steady himself. Panic wouldn't solve anything. He needed a plan. The first step was to call his lawyer, Aaron Novak, who had helped him when he first purchased the shop. She was sharp, reliable, and not one to back down from a fight. Within minutes of explaining the situation, Aaron was already asking the right questions. "Did you take photos of the cars before they were towed?" "Yes," Ryan replied, relieved that he had the foresight to document everything. "Good. And you have records of the towing company's services?" "Yeah, they sent me an invoice and a receipt." "Perfect. Send me everything you have, including any correspondence you've had with Vivian. I'll start drafting a response to the lawsuit." "Don't worry, Ryan will get this sorted." Her confidence was reassuring, but Ryan couldn't ignore the weight pressing down on him. A lawsuit was no small matter, especially for a small business owner like him. Legal fees alone could be crippling, not to mention the time and energy it would take to fight the case. He couldn't afford to let this spiral out of control. Over the next few days, Ryan and Aaron worked together to build his defense. He combed through emails, receipts, and even surveillance footage from the shop's cameras, which clearly showed the cars occupying his lot without permission. Meanwhile, Aaron began preparing to challenge the claims about the supposed injury to Vivian's son. "We'll need to subpoena medical records," she said during one of their calls. "If you really got hurt during the towing, there should be documentation to back it up. If not, it's just another baseless accusation." Ryan nodded, though he couldn't shake the feeling that Vivian wasn't acting alone. The lawsuit was too calculated, too aggressive for someone who had simply lost their temper. It felt like there was more to the story, something he hadn't uncovered yet. As the weeks went by, the situation escalated in ways Ryan hadn't anticipated. One morning, he arrived at the shop to find a crude message spray painted across the back wall parking Tyrant. The letters were large and jagged, the bright red paint dripping down like blood. It was clearly meant to intimidate him, and it worked. Ryan immediately called the police, filing a report and providing them with footage from the security cameras. Unfortunately, the cameras hadn't captured the vandal's face, only a shadowy figure in a hoodie disappearing into the night. The incident rattled Ryan, but he refused to let it derail him. He hired a cleaning service to remove the graffiti and invested in additional security measures, including brighter lights and motion-activated cameras. He wasn't about to let fear dictate his actions. But the attacks didn't stop there. A week later, he found shards of glass scattered across the parking lot, clearly from a broken bottle. It wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately smashed it there, creating a hazard for both customers and their vehicles. Then came the anonymous phone calls. Late at night, Ryan's phone would ring, and when he answered, there was nothing but silence on the other end. Aaron advised him to document everything and stay focused on the legal case. "This is intimidation, plain and simple," she said. "Vivian's trying to rattle you, but don't let her. The best thing you can do is stay calm and let me handle the courtroom." Despite her reassurance, Ryan couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. On more than one occasion, he caught sight of a car idling across the street from the shop, its engine running but its windows darkened. When he stepped outside to investigate, the car would speed off, disappearing around the corner. The tension came to a head during a meeting with Aaron at her office. As they reviewed the latest developments in the case, Aaron paused and looked at him with a serious expression. "Ryan, I need you to prepare for the possibility that this won't be resolved quickly. Vivian is playing dirty, and she's not going to back down easily. But we have the facts on our side, and I promise you, we'll get through this." He nodded, though the weight of the situation was beginning to take its toll. The lawsuit, the vandalism, the anonymous threats, it was all starting to feel like a siege. But Ryan wasn't ready to give up. This shop wasn't just his livelihood, it was a symbol of everything he had worked for, a testament to his perseverance and passion. As he left Aaron's office that evening, Ryan made a silent vow to himself. No matter what Vivian threw at him, he would stand his ground. She might have started this fight, but he was determined to finish it. Little did he know, the battle was about to take an even darker turn. Ryan's resolve to stand his ground was quickly tested as the situation spiraled further out of control. It wasn't just the lawsuit looming over his head, it was the sense that his life was being slowly encroached upon, one petty act of defiance at a time. If Vivian's goal was to make him regret towing her family's cars, she was succeeding. The first sign that things were escalating came on a Monday morning, shortly after Ryan arrived at the shop. The parking lot, now empty in the early hours, was littered with trash fast food wrappers, empty beer cans, and even a cracked plastic chair dumped haphazardly across two spaces. It was clear this wasn't accidental. Someone had gone out of their way to make a mess. Ryan sighed heavily, grabbed a trash bag, and cleaned it up himself. He didn't have time to stew over the situation. His first customer was due within the hour. But it didn't end there. Over the next few days, the incidents multiplied. someone began leaving small puddles of motor oil on the asphalt, right where customers' cars were meant to park. On another occasion, Ryan found a pile of cigarette butts smoldering in the corner of the lot. The final straw came when one of his regular customers, an elderly man who collected vintage guitars, walked in visibly upset. "Ryan, I hate to bring this up," the man said hesitantly, "but when I got out of my car, I stepped on something sharp. My shoe's got a hole in it now, and I think it was a nail." Ryan's jaw tightened. "I'm so sorry that happened. Let me take care of the damage to your shoe and I'll make sure the parking lot's safe." After the customer left, Ryan inspected the area and found several nails scattered across the lot. His stomach turned. This wasn't just an inconvenience anymore. Someone was deliberately sabotaging his property, and it was putting his customers at risk. He immediately installed additional security cameras, focusing on the parking lot, and made a note to check the footage daily. The footage, however, yielded few answers. Most of the incidents occurred late at night, and the individuals responsible were careful to keep their faces obscured. Vivian and her family didn't appear on the recordings, but Ryan had little doubt they were behind the chaos. It was too targeted, too calculated to be random vandalism. Determined not to let this continue, Ryan decided to confront Vivian directly. He waited until the evening, catching her as she was unloading groceries from her car. Her sons were nowhere in sight, which suited him just fine. He didn't want the situation to devolve into a shouting match. "Vivian," he began, his tone calm but firm, "we need to talk." She turned to face him, her expression a mix of annoyance and feigned innocence. "Oh, Ryan, what now?" "I think you know what. The mess in my parking lot, the nails, the oil spills, this isn't a coincidence. It needs to stop." Vivian raised an eyebrow, her lips curling into a smirk. "Are you seriously accusing me of something? I've got better things to do than worry about your little shop." Ryan took a step closer, refusing to be intimidated. "I don't know if it's you, your family, or someone else acting on your behalf, but this has to end. I've got cameras up now, so if it happens again, I'll have proof." For a moment, Vivian's smirk faltered, but she recovered quickly. "Cameras, huh? Well, good for you. Maybe you'll catch whoever's been messing with your precious parking lot. But don't come knocking on my door with baseless accusations. My family's got nothing to do with it." Ryan clenched his jaw, realizing the conversation was going nowhere. "Just stay away from my property, Vivian. That's all I'm asking." She didn't respond, simply turning her back on him and walking toward her front door. Ryan stood there for a moment, seething, before heading back to his shop. The next morning, things took a turn for the worse. Ryan arrived to find his store's front door slightly ajar. His heart raced as he pushed it open, fearing the worst. Inside, nothing appeared to be stolen, but the place was in disarray. Sheet music had been scattered across the floor, a display case had been knocked over, and someone had drawn crude, mocking faces on the windows using some kind of grease. Ryan called the police immediately. An officer arrived within the hour, taking photos and asking questions. "Do you have any idea who might be responsible for this?" the officer asked. Ryan hesitated. He didn't have hard evidence linking Vivian or her family to the break-in, and accusing them without proof could backfire. "I've had some issues with a neighbor," he admitted cautiously. "But I don't want to jump to conclusions." The officer nodded, jotting down notes. "We'll check for fingerprints and see if anything comes up. In the meantime, I'd recommend upgrading your locks and maybe getting an alarm system." By the time the officer left, Ryan felt more exhausted than ever. He knew the vandalism was part of the same campaign of harassment he'd been dealing with, but the lack of concrete evidence left him feeling powerless. That afternoon, he had the locks changed and installed a basic alarm system, hoping it would be enough to deter further incidents. Erin, his lawyer, wasn't surprised when he told her about the break-in. "This is textbook intimidation," she said during their next meeting. "They're trying to wear you down, make you feel like it's not worth fighting the lawsuit." "Well, it's working," Ryan admitted, rubbing his temples. "I'm doing everything I can to keep my business running, but it feels like they're always one step ahead." "Don't let them get in your head," Erin said firmly. "You've got the law on your side, and as long as we stick to the facts, we'll win this case." Her words were comforting, but the pressure was mounting. The lawsuit alone was enough to keep him up at night, but the constant harassment was pushing him to his limits. Every time he walked into the shop, he half expected to find something else destroyed or tampered with. One evening, as Ryan was closing up, he noticed a car idling across the street. It was the same car he'd seen several times before, its windows darkened and its engine humming softly. For a moment, he considered walking over to confront the driver, but something held him back. Instead, he snapped a photo of the car with his phone and made a mental note to mention it to Aaron. That night, Ryan lay awake, staring at the ceiling. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was about more than just a parking dispute. The intensity of the harassment, the calculated nature of the attacks, it all pointed to something larger at play. But what? As he drifted off to sleep, one thought kept circling in his mind. If Vivian thought she could scare him into submission, she was in for a rude awakening. This wasn't just about his shop anymore. It was about standing up for himself no matter the cost. Ryan had reached his limit. The vandalism, the mounting legal pressure, and the constant feeling of being watched had pushed him to the brink. He spent most nights lying awake, running through everything in his head: the lawsuit, the break-in, the garbage strewn across his lot. The once stable life he'd built was now a battlefield, with him fighting to protect his livelihood from Vivian Clark's relentless campaign. But he wasn't going to let her win. If this was war, then Ryan was prepared to fight back. It started with a decision to shift his focus from defense to offense. After weeks of reacting to each new problem, he realized he needed to take proactive steps to protect himself and his business. The first move was rallying support from the other business owners in the area. Ryan had kept his struggles mostly to himself, but now it was time to bring others into the fold. He began by reaching out to the owner of the bakery next door, a middle-aged woman named Linda who had always been friendly. Over coffee in her shop, Ryan explained everything: the lawsuit, the vandalism, and the growing sense that Vivian's family was targeting him. Linda listened intently, her brow furrowing as he spoke. "That's awful," she said when he finished. "I've had some issues with her too. Her sons park their trucks in my delivery zone all the time, and when I asked them to move, they just laughed. I didn't realize it was this bad, though." Ryan leaned forward. "It's not just about me. If she's doing this to my business, who's to say she won't try it with yours or someone else's? We need to stand together." Linda nodded slowly. "You're right. What do you need from me?" "I'm organizing a meeting with other business owners in the area," Ryan explained. "If we all document what's been happening and present it to the city, we might be able to get some action. At the very least, we'll show Vivian that she can't push us around." Linda agreed to spread the word, and over the next few days, Ryan spoke to several other local business owners. Some were hesitant to get involved, worried about retaliation, but others were eager to join the effort. One of them, a retired mechanic named George who ran a small auto repair shop, shared a particularly troubling story. "She's been doing this for years," George said, shaking his head. "Back when I first opened, her oldest son keyed one of my customers' cars because it was parked too close to their house. When I confronted her about it, she acted like I was the problem. I've just been ignoring them ever since, but maybe it's time to push back." The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening at Ryan's shop. 7 business owners showed up, each bringing their own stories of harassment, intimidation, or petty annoyances caused by Vivian and her family. As they talked, a pattern began to emerge. Vivian's behavior wasn't random, it was calculated. She targeted businesses she perceived as weak or isolated, using her family to create chaos and drive people out. "I heard she's been trying to buy up properties in the area," Linda said during the discussion. "That's what she does. She makes it impossible for you to run your business, and when you're desperate, she offers to take the property off your hands for a fraction of what it's worth." Ryan's jaw tightened. It made sense. The intensity of her attacks, the lawsuit, even the mysterious car that had been watching his shop, it all pointed to a larger scheme. She wasn't just angry about the towing incident, she was trying to force him out. As the meeting continued, they drafted a formal letter to the city, detailing their collective experiences with Vivian and her family. They also agreed to pool resources to hire a private security company to patrol the area at night. It was an expensive step, but they couldn't afford to let her escalate her harassment any further. Meanwhile, Erin continued to build Ryan's legal defense. She had subpoenaed the medical records for Vivian's son, and the results were exactly what they expected. There was no evidence of any injury. The entire claim had been fabricated. Erin was also preparing to file a countersuit for defamation and harassment, using the footage from Ryan's security cameras as evidence. "We're turning the tide," Erin told Ryan during one of their meetings. "Her story is falling apart, and once the judge sees how much she's been lying, this case will collapse. But we need to stay vigilant. People like Vivian don't go down without a fight." Ryan nodded, though the weight of the situation still pressed heavily on his shoulders. Even with the support of his neighbors and Erin's confidence, the stress was unrelenting. He couldn't shake the feeling that Vivian had another trick up her sleeve. That suspicion was confirmed late one night when Ryan was reviewing the latest security footage. At first, everything seemed normal. The lot was empty, and the street was quiet. But then he noticed something odd. A man in a hooded jacket appeared on the edge of the screen, pacing back and forth near the shop's entrance. He stayed there for several minutes before disappearing out of view. A few minutes later, the same man reappeared, this time carrying a crowbar. Ryan's heart raced as he watched the footage. The man approached the shop's door, testing the handle before using the crowbar to try to pry it open. Fortunately, the new locks held, and after a few unsuccessful attempts, the man gave up and fled. Ryan immediately called the police, who arrived within minutes. He showed them the footage, and while they promised to investigate, their tone made it clear they didn't expect to catch the perpetrator. The next morning, Ryan shared the footage with Erin, who suspected the break-in attempt was another intimidation tactic. "They're trying to scare you," she said. "But this just makes their case look even worse. Keep documenting everything, and we'll use it to show the court how far they're willing to go." Despite Erin's reassurances, Ryan couldn't help but feel unnerved. He doubled down on security, adding more cameras and motion-activated lights around the shop. He also started carrying pepper spray, just in case. The man with the crowbar hadn't succeeded this time, but Ryan wasn't taking any chances. The breakthrough came a few days later when one of the business owners, George, approached Ryan with new information. "You're not going to believe this," George said, holding up a folder of documents. "I did some digging, and I found out that Vivian's family is tied to a local property developer. They've been working together to drive people out of this area so they can buy up the land and build a shopping complex." Ryan's blood boiled as he flipped through the documents. They included emails, property records, and even a map showing the planned development. His shop, along with several others, was right in the middle of the proposed site. "This explains everything," Ryan said, his voice trembling with anger. "She's not just trying to get rid of me, she's trying to take over the whole neighborhood." George nodded. "The developer's been using families like hers to do their dirty work. They create chaos, drive property values down, and then swoop in to buy the land cheap. It's a dirty game." Ryan took the documents to Erin, who saw them as a game changer. "This is huge," she said. "If we can tie Vivian to this scheme, it'll destroy her credibility in court. And if the city gets wind of what's happening, they might shut the whole thing down." The revelation reignited Ryan's determination. For the first time in weeks, he felt like he had the upper hand. Vivian had underestimated him, thinking he was just another small business owner she could push around. But she was about to learn the hard way that Ryan Drake wasn't going anywhere. The revelation that Vivian Clark was working with a property developer to destabilize the neighborhood ignited a fire in Ryan that he hadn't felt in weeks. For too long, he had been on the defensive, reacting to each new act of vandalism, harassment, and legal pressure. But now, with the documents George had uncovered, he had proof of a larger scheme, a scheme that went beyond petty parking disputes and threatened not just his business, but the entire community. It was time to strike back. Ryan and Erin quickly went to work. The documents were damning email correspondence between Vivian and representatives of the developer discussing uncooperative property owners, financial transactions that hinted at bribes, and detailed plans for a shopping complex that would require the demolition of several existing businesses. Erin filed a motion to introduce the evidence into court, arguing that it was directly relevant to the lawsuit. "This changes everything," Erin said, her tone sharp with focus. "If we can prove Vivian's harassment was part of a coordinated effort to devalue your property, her lawsuit won't just get thrown out, she could face countersuits from everyone she's targeted." Ryan nodded, but he knew they were far from out of the woods. Vivian wouldn't back down easily, and the developer behind her likely had resources that dwarfed his own. The battle was about to get even more intense. The retaliation began almost immediately. 2 days after Erin filed the motion, Ryan arrived at the shop to find his parking lot completely blocked off by construction barriers. Bright orange cones and no entry. Signs had been placed strategically across the lot, making it impossible for customers to park. A small handwritten note was taped to one of the signs: "Safety inspection lot temporarily closed." Ryan's blood boiled. There was no safety inspection. This was another ploy to sabotage his business. He immediately called the city's public works department to ask if they had issued any permits for his property. After being transferred through several departments, he finally got an answer: no permits had been issued for any construction or inspections at his address. He hung up and began removing the barriers himself, tossing the cones and signs onto the sidewalk. It took nearly an hour to clear the lot, and by the time he finished, several customers had already come and gone, unable to find parking. Ryan clenched his fists, knowing exactly who was behind this but unable to prove it. That evening, Ryan called a meeting with the other business owners who had joined his coalition. They gathered in his shop, the mood tense but determined. "They're getting desperate," Ryan said, recounting the latest incident. "The barriers, the vandalism, the lawsuit, it's all connected. They know we're onto them, and they're trying to scare us into backing down." George spoke up, his voice steady. "Let them try. We've got the documents, and we've got the truth on our side. They can't intimidate all of us." Linda, the bakery owner, nodded in agreement. "But we need to make sure we're covering our bases. If they're willing to go this far, what's stopping them from escalating even more?" The group discussed hiring a private investigator to dig deeper into the developer's activities. If they could uncover more evidence of corruption or illegal practices, it would strengthen their case and put even more pressure on Vivian and her backers. Ryan agreed to contribute part of the cost, and several others volunteered to chip in as well. Meanwhile, Erin was preparing for the next court hearing, where the judge would decide whether to allow the new evidence. "They're going to fight tooth and nail to keep this out," she warned Ryan. "If the judge sides with us, they'll know they're in real trouble." The hearing was set for the following week, but the harassment didn't let up in the meantime. One night, as Ryan was locking up the shop, he noticed a car idling at the end of the street. It was the same black sedan he had seen multiple times before. This time, he decided to confront it. Ryan grabbed his phone and began walking toward the car, his heart pounding. As he approached, the driver suddenly sped off, tires screeching as the vehicle disappeared around the corner. Ryan managed to snap a photo of the license plate before it was out of sight. The next morning, he handed the photo to Erin, who passed it along to the private investigator they had hired. The investigator, a no-nonsense woman named Claire, promised to look into it. "This kind of intimidation isn't uncommon in cases like this," Claire said. "Developers hire people to apply pressure, make you think you're being watched. But it's all smoke and mirrors. They don't want a real confrontation, they just want you to feel vulnerable." Despite Claire's reassurances, the pressure was mounting. That same week, Ryan received an anonymous letter in the mail. The envelope was unmarked, and inside was a single sheet of paper with 3 words typed in bold letters: "Sell and leave." Ryan showed the letter to Erin, who added it to the growing pile of evidence. "It's a scare tactic," she said, "but it just makes them look worse. The more they try to intimidate you, the stronger our case gets." The hearing finally arrived, and as expected, Vivian's lawyer fought hard to exclude the new evidence. He argued that the documents were irrelevant to the case and an invasion of privacy, but Erin countered with a calm, methodical presentation of their importance. "These emails and financial records establish a clear pattern of harassment," Erin told the judge. "They show that the plaintiff's actions were not motivated by any legitimate grievance, but by a larger scheme to force the defendant out of his property. This goes to the heart of the case and must be considered." After reviewing the evidence, the judge ruled in their favor. The documents would be admitted, and Vivian's lawsuit would now be scrutinized in the context of the broader scheme. Vivian looked visibly shaken as the judge made the ruling. Her lawyer leaned over to whisper something to her, but she didn't respond. Ryan couldn't help but feel a surge of satisfaction. For the first time, it seemed like the tide was turning. But the victory was short-lived. That night, Ryan's phone buzzed with an alert from his security system. One of the new cameras he had installed showed two men in dark clothing prowling around the back of the shop. Ryan immediately called the police, who arrived within minutes, but the intruders were gone by the time they got there. The next day, Ryan found a crack in one of the shop's back windows, as if someone had thrown a rock. It was another message, another attempt to make him think twice about continuing the fight. Claire, the private investigator, called later that afternoon with an update. "We tracked the license plate from the car you saw," she said. "It's registered to an employee of the developer, a security consultant they've used before. This ties them directly to the intimidation." Ryan felt a mix of anger and determination. The evidence was piling up, but so was the risk. He knew Vivian and the developer weren't going to back down without a fight. As he stood in his shop that evening, staring out at the parking lot, Ryan made a promise to himself. He wouldn't let fear dictate his actions. He had come too far and sacrificed too much to let them win. The battle wasn't over yet, but he was ready for whatever came next. The courthouse was buzzing with quiet tension as Ryan walked through its echoing halls. He adjusted his tie, trying to calm the storm brewing inside him. This hearing wasn't just about clearing his name or saving his shop, it was about exposing Vivian Clark and the shadowy web of corruption she represented. With Aaron at his side and a thick folder of evidence in hand, Ryan felt prepared, but the stakes had never been higher. Vivian was already seated in the courtroom when Ryan entered, her lawyer whispering something to her with an air of urgency. Her expression was smug, but there was an edge to it, a flicker of uncertainty that told Ryan she was feeling the pressure. The judge, an older man with a stern face and sharp eyes, called the session to order, and the case officially began. Vivian's lawyer wasted no time painting her as a victim. He spoke of how she and her family had been publicly humiliated by the towing incident, and how Ryan's alleged actions had caused her son physical injury and her family emotional distress. The narrative was carefully crafted, but as Aaron had warned, it was full of holes. When it was Aaron's turn, she dismantled their claims piece by piece. First, she presented the medical records, which showed no evidence of any injury to Vivian's son. Then she introduced security footage from Ryan's cameras, clearly showing the unauthorized parking and vandalism. Each clip highlighted Vivian's blatant disregard for Ryan's property rights, leaving little room for argument. The courtroom shifted uncomfortably as Aaron moved on to the real bombshell, the emails and financial records linking Vivian to the property developer. She laid them out methodically, explaining how they revealed a coordinated effort to harass and intimidate local business owners into abandoning their properties. The judge leaned forward in his seat, his expression hardening as Aaron presented the map of the proposed development, with Ryan's shop and several others marked for demolition. "This is not a case of a simple neighborhood dispute," Aaron said firmly, her voice ringing through the courtroom. "This is a calculated campaign to force my client out of his property, orchestrated by the plaintiff and her associates for financial gain." Vivian's lawyer stood up, attempting to object, but the judge silenced him with a sharp look. "You'll have your turn to respond," he said. "Continue, MS. Novak?" Aaron brought the private investigator Claire to the stand. Claire testified about the car registered to the developer's employee, tying them to the intimidation tactics Ryan had faced. She also described the patterns of harassment and property sabotage that matched similar cases in other areas where the developer had expanded. As the evidence piled up, Vivian's composure began to crack. She whispered frantically to her lawyer, her smug demeanor giving way to visible frustration. When her lawyer finally called her to the stand, she tried to maintain her usual confidence, but under Aaron's cross-examination, the cracks widened. Aaron started with straightforward questions about the towing incident, gradually leading Vivian into a corner. You claim that my client's actions caused your family financial and emotional distress, Aaron said, pacing slowly in front of the jury. Yet you failed to mention that your family had repeatedly ignored his warnings and parked on his private property. Is that correct? Vivian hesitated, her gaze darting toward her lawyer. Yes, but that's not the point. He had no right to. Let's talk about rights, Aaron interrupted smoothly. Did you or your family ever have permission to park in Mr. Drake's lot? Vivian's face flushed. No, but... And did you inform the towing company that your son was injured during the towing process? No, but he was. Was he taken to a hospital? Did he see a doctor? No, Vivian admitted, her voice growing quieter. Aaron paused for effect, then leaned in. Ms. Clark, are you aware that fabricating a personal injury claim can result in legal consequences? Vivian didn't answer. The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Aaron shifted gears, pulling up an enlarged copy of one of the emails between Vivian and the developer. Let's talk about your relationship with Western Horizon Properties. Can you explain why you were corresponding with them about local business owners and their properties? Vivian's lawyer jumped to his feet. Objection. This is irrelevant to the case at hand. The judge frowned. Overruled. Ms. Clark, you may answer. Vivian fumbled for words, her confidence unraveling. It was just about community development. They wanted my input as a resident. And did this community development involve pressuring small business owners to sell their properties at reduced prices? Aaron pressed. No. That's ridiculous. Vivian's voice rose, but it lacked conviction. The jury was watching her closely now, their skepticism clear. The final blow came when Aaron introduced testimony from George, the mechanic, who described his own experiences with Vivian's family. He spoke about their history of harassment and intimidation, painting a vivid picture of their pattern of behavior. Combined with the evidence of the developer's involvement, it was a devastating case. When the judge called a recess, Vivian slumped in her seat, visibly shaken. Ryan could feel the tide turning. For the first time since this ordeal began, he felt a glimmer of hope. After the recess, the judge delivered his verdict. The claims against Ryan were dismissed, the evidence proving that Vivian's lawsuit was baseless and malicious. The judge didn't stop there. He also referred the case to the district attorney's office for further investigation into the developer's activities and Vivian's role in the harassment. As the courtroom emptied, Ryan stood by Aaron's side, feeling a weight lift from his shoulders. Vivian stormed out without a word, her lawyer trailing behind her. It wasn't just a legal victory, it was a moral one. He had fought back against intimidation, lies, and greed, and he had won. But Ryan knew this wasn't the end. The investigation into the developer would take time, and there was still work to be done to protect the community. For now, though, he allowed himself a moment of relief, knowing he had stood his ground and reclaimed his life. The courtroom victory marked a turning point for Ryan Drake, but the aftermath of the battle was far from a clean slate. While the judge's dismissal of Vivian's baseless lawsuit had been a personal triumph, the scars of the ordeal lingered. His business, though still standing, had taken a hit from weeks of harassment, vandalism, and the looming uncertainty of the case. Customers had dwindled during the most chaotic weeks, and the parking lot, now fully his again, seemed emptier than it had been in years. Ryan knew he couldn't allow the damage to define him or his shop. The day after the hearing, he arrived at work early, determined to begin rebuilding. He started by scrubbing away the last traces of graffiti from the back wall, repainting it in a warm, inviting shade. He replaced the cracked window pane from the attempted break-in and laid fresh gravel across the parking lot, erasing the scars left by oil spills and debris. It wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about reclaiming his space and restoring what had been taken from him. Word of Ryan's victory spread quickly through the neighborhood. Other business owners, inspired by his resilience, began organizing their own efforts to fortify their properties and stand united against any future threats. George, the mechanic who had testified on Ryan's behalf, stopped by one afternoon to discuss a proposal for creating a shared security network among the local shops. Strength in numbers, George said, handing Ryan a printed plan for hiring a rotating security patrol. We've all got too much to lose to let anyone pull this kind of stunt again." Ryan nodded, grateful for the solidarity. "Count me in. If we stick together, they won't stand a chance." The developer linked to Vivian's harassment quickly found themselves in hot water. The district attorney's office launched an investigation into their practices, uncovering a web of shady deals and questionable tactics that stretched beyond Ryan's neighborhood. When a local news outlet picked up the story, it sparked outrage and led to calls for tighter regulations on property developers in the area. As for Vivian, her downfall was swift and public. The court's findings, combined with the mounting evidence of her role in the harassment campaign, made her a pariah in the community. Her property, once a hub of chaos, fell silent. Her sons stopped parking their trucks in other people's lots, and the RV that had been a permanent eyesore vanished overnight. Ryan didn't revel in her disgrace, but he felt a sense of justice knowing she was no longer in a position to harm anyone else. With the storm behind him, Ryan focused on revitalizing his business. He hosted a grand reopening event, inviting customers, neighbors, and friends to celebrate the shop's fresh start. The parking lot was filled with laughter and music as guests admired the antique instruments on display and shared stories of their own brushes with resilience. Linda from the bakery brought a tray of pastries, and George set up a small booth offering free tune-ups for anyone who had driven in for the event. Amid the festivities, Ryan reflected on how far he had come. The battle with Vivian had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, forcing him to confront not only external threats but also his own doubts and fears. He had learned the value of community and the power of standing together against injustice. More than that, he had rediscovered his own strength. As the sun set on the day of the reopening, Ryan stood in the parking lot, watching the last of the guests leave. The lot, once a symbol of conflict, now felt like a place of triumph. He took a deep breath, the cool evening air filling his lungs, and allowed himself a rare moment of contentment. For the first time in months, he wasn't looking over his shoulder. The shadows that had loomed over his life were gone, and in their place was a future he was ready to build one note, one customer, and one victory at a time.